Hello, I'm Jared Taylor with American Renaissance. Today in America, we're supposed to believe astonishing things about black people. One is that it's only thanks to them that the United States became rich and powerful. Let's try to figure this out. This book, The Half Has Never Been Told: Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism, calls itself a groundbreaking history demonstrating that America's economic supremacy was built on the backs of slaves. The author teaches at Cornell, so he's got to be right, right? And this is the stuff that prompted the New York Times 1619 Project. It aims to reframe the country's history by placing the consequences of slavery and the contributions of black Americans at the very center of our national narrative. 1619 was the year the first blacks were brought to Virginia, and they were so crucially important that 1619 should be thought of as the year of our founding, not 1776. Here are the articles from the series, with the one right at the top called America Wasn't a Democracy Until Black Americans Made It One. I bet you didn't know that. We also have cruel prisons, no universal health care, brutal capitalism, and even traffic jams because of slavery. I'm not sure how those things made America rich and powerful, but somehow, I guess they did. Blacks were never more than 20% of the population, and from the 1920s to the 40s, they were less than 10%. But the whole time, they were sweating away, making America rich and powerful. They're now 13% of the population, but I see no evidence that they are making us economically supreme. If slavery made us all rich, here are the people who did it. But look at this. It's a map of the slave trade that shows where the slaves went from 1500 onward. What became the United States imported just 400,000 slaves, about 3% of all of the slaves that crossed the Atlantic. The British Caribbean islands alone imported 11 times as many. And look at Brazil, stuffed with slaves. If black slavery was such a bonanza, why didn't those places become superpowers? Did white Southerners have some kind of unique genius for making slaves productive? No. In fact, American slaves were just about the least productive because they were looked after from the time they were babies and then kept into old age. Most of those millions of slaves that went to the Caribbean and Brazil were grown men who were worked to death. The owners didn't have the expense of children or old folks. And what about black countries? If Africans are so immensely productive, why is every black country a mess? Are black people immensely productive only when white people are around to tell them what to do? And another little problem. There are half a dozen countries in Europe that have a higher per capita income than the United States, and Australia and Canada aren't far behind. They didn't have black slaves. How ever did they manage? The truth is, slavery tied the American South to agriculture and kept it from industrializing. And even today, the blackest places in the United States are always the poorest. The United States became rich and powerful despite slavery. There's another crazy thing we're supposed to think about blacks. Even though they are wonderful, hardworking, productive people, they are strangely vulnerable to whatever is meant by racism. It's not good enough for whites to stop discriminating. That's what people thought back in the 1960s. Back then, the solution was to be colorblind and treat everyone the same. How silly they were. Now we know, as the Atlantic explains, that colorblindness is counterproductive. There's a whole book called Colorblind Racism, which explains that it can perpetuate inequality and violence. Just trying to treat people the same was good enough for Asians, but for blacks, it perpetuates inequality and violence. We now know that even silence is violence to blacks. It's like sicking police dogs on them. Or is it that black people shoot each other because whites are silent? I forget. But it's clear that terrible things happen if we aren't constantly trying to change the world for their benefit. Here, a white woman writing for Forbes explains, white women, 3 ways to sustain anti-racism as a lifelong commitment. A lifelong commitment is more than a lot of women give their husbands these days. She writes that being anti-racist requires a lifetime of confronting our privilege, interrogating our whiteness, and following the leadership of BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. And here is a genuine BIPOC lady herself, Tatiana Mack, telling white people, we need you to do all you're doing today, tomorrow, and until the end of time. Black people need us until the end of time. The people who made America rich and powerful will never make it on their own. I tell you, this stuff is profound. We have made other remarkable discoveries. You may have heard that black people commit crime at higher rates than anyone else. Now we finally know why. It's right here in the New York Times. Police can't solve the problem. They are the problem. The authors, both black, write, the reality is this: the police fill prisons. Stop investing money, power, and legitimacy in them. And here's another lady who's got it figured out. Ash Lee Woodward Henderson. She says, when we say defund the police, we really mean it. She says the police criminalize blacks and their culture. So the solution is simple. Fire all the police officers and give the money that you've saved to black people. People are wondering why people in my neighborhood do harmful things to each other. It's because they're desperate. It's because we're not actually investing in the things that would give them what they needed, so they didn't need to break the law to get it. Well, I wonder what they were breaking the law in order to get in Chicago just last week to produce this headline. Chicago's most violent weekend of 2021. 104 shot, 19 of them killed, 13 kids among the wounded. I guess they were so desperate that they had to shoot children in order to get food and shelter. Well, at least some of the crazy things we were once supposed to believe have finally been disproven. Do you remember when it was all the rage to claim that the ancient Egyptians were black and that Napoleon's men blew the nose off the Sphinx because they couldn't stand a black face looking down at them? In 2017, scientists were able to extract and study the ancient DNA of Egyptian mummies from 1300 BC to 30 BC. The result? Instead of finding that ancient Egyptians were more African, we actually found them to be almost zero, or much less sub-Saharan African than the population that live in Egypt today. But don't worry, the myth lives on. There's something larger than life about black people, isn't there? A mythic quality. That must be why there are 2 national holidays just for black people, MLK Day and now Juneteenth. Nobody else gets that treatment. Well, is it to thank them for making our country so rich and powerful? Or is it because they gave us democracy? Or is it to boost their self-esteem so they'll try to get off welfare? As I say, this stuff is profound. Thank you for watching. Please be sure to subscribe to this video channel. Also, I invite you to visit amren.com, amren.com. You find videos, podcasts, articles, discussions, I think a lot of things that will interest you. But especially, thanks again for watching.